Loken cut a gory crescent through the bodies pressing in on him, Vipers matching him stroke for stroke with his long chainsword. Strategy and weapons meant nothing now. The battle was simply a brutal close-quarters fight to the death. Such a contest could have only one outcome. Loathing filled Loken. Not at the blood and death around him, he had seen much worse before, but at the sheer waste of this war. The people he was killing. Their lives could have meant something. They could have accepted the imperial truth and helped forge a galaxy where the human race was united and the wisdom of the Emperor ushered them towards a future filled with wonders. Instead, they had been betrayed and turned into fanatical killers by a corrupt leader, destined to die for a cause that was a lie. Good lives wasted. Nothing could be further from the purpose of the Imperium.
Torgadden, bring the line forwards. Force them back and give the guns some room. Easier said than done, Galvey,
replied Torgadden, his voice punctuated with the sharp crack of breaking bones. Loken glanced around, saw one of Lacoste's squad dragged down by the mass of enemy warriors, and tried to bring his bolter to bear. Bloodied, ruined hands forced his aim down, and the battle brother was lost. He dropped his shoulder and barged forwards, bodies breaking beneath him, but others were on top of him, blades and bullets beating at his armor. With a roar of anger, Loken ripped his chainsword through an armored warrior before him, forcing the enemy back for the split second he needed to open up with his bolter. A full-throated volley sent a magazine's worth of shells into the mass, blasting them apart in a red ruin of shattered faces and broken armor. He rapidly swapped in a new bolter magazine and fired among the warriors trying to swamp his fellow sons of Horus. The Astartes used the openings to forge onwards or open up spaces to bring their own weapons up. Others lent their gunfire to the battle brothers fighting behind them. The tone of the war singer's screaming changed, and Loken felt as though rusty nails were being torn up his spine. He staggered, and the enemy were upon him.
Torgadden,
he shouted over the din.
Get the war singer.
My apologies, War Master,
began Malakhurst, nervous at interrupting the War Master's concentration on the battle below.
There has been a development.
In the city? Asked Horus without looking up.
On the ship,
replied Malakhurst. Horus looked up in irritation. Explain yourself.
The Prime Iterator, Kirill Sinderman.
Old Kirill, said Horus. What of him?
It appears we have misjudged the man's character, my lord.
In what way, Mal? Asked Horus. He's just an old man.
That he is, but he may be a greater threat than anything we have yet faced, my lord, said Malakhurst. He is a leader now. An apostle, they call him. He...
A leader, interrupted Horus. Of whom?
Of the people of the fleet, civilians, ship's crew, and the Lectitio Divinitatis. He has just finished a speech to the fleet, calling on them to resist the Legion, saying that we are warmongers and seek to betray the Emperor. We are trying to trace where the signal came from, but it is likely he will be long gone before we find him.
I see, said Horus. This problem should have been dealt with before Istvan.
And we have failed you in this, said Malakhurst. The Iterator mixed calls for peace with a potent brew of religion and faith.
This should not surprise us, said Horus. Sinderman was selected for duty with my fleet precisely because he could convince even the most fractious rabble to do anything. Mix that skill with religious fervor, and he is indeed a dangerous man.
They believe the Emperor is divine, said Malakhurst, and that we commit blasphemy.
It must be an intoxicating faith, mused Horus, and faith can be a very powerful weapon. It appears, Malakhurst, that we have underestimated the potential that even a civilian possesses, so long as he has genuine faith in something.
What would you have me do, my lord?
We did not deal with this threat properly, said Horus. It should have ceased to exist when Varvarus and those troublesome remembrances were illuminated. Now it takes my attention when our plan is at its most sensitive stage. The bombardment is imminent. Malakhurst bowed his head.
War Master, Sinderman and his kind will be destroyed.
The next I hear of this will be that they are all dead, ordered Horus.
It will be done,
promised Malakhurst.
fool!
spat Prowl, his voice a disgusted rasp.
Have you not seen this world? The wonders you would destroy. This is a city of the gods.
Lucius rolled to his feet, still stunned from the sonic shockwave that had hurled him from the throne dais, but knowing that the song of death was being sung for him, and him alone. He lunged, but Prowl batted aside his attack, bringing his spear up in a neat guard. "This is the city of my enemies," laughed Lucius. "That is all that matters to me."
You are deaf to the music of the galaxy. I have heard far more than you, said Prowl. Perhaps you are to be pitied, for I have listened to the sound of the gods. I have heard their song, and they damn this galaxy in their wisdom.
Lucius laughed in Prowl's face.
"You think I care? All I want to do is kill you."
"The gods have sung what your imperial truth will bring to the galaxy," shrieked Prowl, his musical voice heavy with disdain.
It is a future of fear and hatred. I was deaf to the music before they opened me to their song of oblivion. It is my duty to end your crusade.
"You can try," said Lucius. "But even if you kill us all, more will come. 100,000 more, 1,000,000, until this planet is dust. Your little rebellion is over. You just don't know it yet."
No, Astartes, replied Prowl. I have fulfilled my duty and brought you here, to this cauldron of fates. My work is done. All that remains is to blood myself in the name of Father Istvan.
Lucius danced away as Prowl attacked once more with the razor-sharp feints of a master warrior. But the swordsman had faced better opponents than this, and prevailed. The song of death rippled behind his eyes, and he could see every move Prowl made before he made it. The song speaking to him on a level he didn't understand, but instinctively knew was power beyond anything he had touched before. He launched a flurry of blows at Prowl, driving him back with each attack, and no matter how skillfully Prowl parried his strikes, each one came that little bit closer to wounding him. The flicker of fear he saw in Prowl's eyes filled him with brutal triumph. The shrieking musical spear blared one last atonal scream before it finally shattered under the energized edge of Lucius's sword. The swordsman pivoted smoothly on his heel and drove his blade two-handed into Prowl's golden chest, the sword burning through his armor, ribs, and internal organs. Prowl dropped to his knees, still alive, his mouth working dumbly as blood sprayed from the massive wound. Lucius twisted the blade, relishing the cracks as Prowl's ribs snapped. He put a foot on Prowl's body and pulled the sword clear, standing triumphant over the body of his fallen enemy. Around him, the Emperor's children slew the remaining palace guards. But with Prowl dead, the song in his blood diminished, and his interest in the fight faded. Lucius turned to the throne itself, already aching for the music to surge through his body once again. The throne's back was to him, and he couldn't see who was seated there. A control panel worked furiously before him, like a monstrously complicated clockwork keyboard. Lucius stepped around the throne and looked into the glassy eyes of a servitor. Its head was mounted on the skinny body of metal armatures, the complex innards stripped out and replaced with brass clockwork. Chattering metal tines reached from the chest cavity to read the music printed in the books mounted around the throne, and the servitor's hands, elaborate 20-fingered constructions of metal and wire, flickered over the control panel. Without Prowl, the music was out of tune and time, its syncopated rhythms falling apart. Lucius knew that this was a poor substitute for what had fueled his battle with Prowl. Suddenly, angry beyond words, Lucius brought his blade down in a glittering arc, shattering the control panel in a shower of orange sparks. The hideous music transformed into a howling death shriek, shaking the stone petals of the palace with its terrible, deafening wail before fading like a forgotten dream. The music of creation ended, and all across Istvan, the voices of the gods were silenced. A volley of gunfire caught Loken's attention as he desperately fought the dozens of guards who stabbed at him with their gleaming halberds. Behind him, Torgadden brought the spear tip up into a firing line, and bolter fire battered against the black iron of Death's mausoleum. The war singer was broken like a dying bird against the statue of Father Istvan. The war singer fell, her final scream tailing off as her shattered form cracked against the ornate carvings of Death's mausoleum.
She's down,
said Torgadden's voice over the vox, sounding surprised at the ease with which she had been killed.
Who have we lost?
Asked Loken, as the enemy soldiers fell back at the war singer's death, suspecting that there was more to this withdrawal than simply her death. Something fundamental had changed on Istvan, but he didn't yet know what.
Most of Squad Chagrat,
replied Torgadden,
and plenty of others. We won't know until we get out of here, but there's something else.
What? Asked Loken.
Lacoste says we've lost contact with orbit, said Torgadden. There's no signal. It's as if the vengeful spirit isn't even up there.
That's impossible, said Loken, looking around for the familiar sight of Sergeant Lacoste. He saw him at the edge of the charnel pit and marched over to him. Torgadden and Vipers followed him, and Torgadden said,
Impossible or not, it's what he tells me. What about the rest of the strike force?
Asked Loken, crouching beside Lacoste.
What about the palace?
We're having more luck with them, replied Lacoste. I managed to get through to Captain Erlin of the World Eaters. It sounds like they're outside the palace. It's an absolute massacre over there. Thousands of civilians dead.
In the name of terror,
said Loken, imagining the World Eaters' predilection for massacre and the rivers of blood that would be flowing through the streets of the Coral City.
Have they managed to contact anyone in orbit?
They've got their hands full, Captain, replied Lacoste. Even if they've managed to raise the Conqueror, they're in no position to relay anything from us. I could barely get anything out of Erlin, other than that he was killing them with his bare hands.
And the palace?
Nothing. I can't get through to Captain Lucius of the Emperor's Children. The palace has been playing hell with communications ever since they went in. There was some kind of music, but nothing else.
Then try the Death Guard.
They've got the Deus Irae with them. We can use it to relay for us. I'll try, sir, but it's not looking hopeful.
This was supposed to be over by now,
spat Loken.
The Coral City isn't just going to collapse with their leaders dead. Maybe the World Eaters have the right idea. We're going to have to kill them all. We need the second wave down here now, and if we can't even speak to the War Master, this is going to be a very long campaign.
I'll keep trying, said Lacoste.
We need to link up with the rest of the strike force, said Loken. We're cut off here. We need to make for the palace and find the World Eaters or the Emperor's Children. We're not doing any good sitting here. All we're doing is giving the Istvanians a chance to surround us.
There's a lot of soldiers between us and the rest of the strike force, Torgadden pointed out.
Then we advance in force. We won't take this city by waiting to be attacked.
Agreed. I saw the main gates along the western walls. We can get into the city proper there, but it'll be a tough slog.
Good,
said Loken.
It's a trap, said Mercedy. It has to be.
You're probably right, agreed Cinderman.
Of course I'm right, said Mercedy. Malakhurst tried to have Euphrates killed. His pet monster Maggard almost killed you too, remember?
I remember very well, said Cinderman. But think of the opportunity. There will be thousands there, and they couldn't possibly try anything with that many people around. They probably won't even notice we're there. Mercedy looked down her nose at Cinderman, unable to believe that the old iterator was being so dense. Had he not spoken to hundreds of people only hours before of the War Master's perfidy? And now he wanted to gather in a room with him? They had been woken from their slumbers by one of the engineering crew, who pressed a rolled leaflet into Cinderman's shaking hand. Sharing a worried glance with Mercedy, Cinderman had read it. It was a decree from the War Master authorizing all remembrances to gather in the Vengeful Spirit's main audience chamber to bear witness to the final triumph on Istvan III. It spoke of the gulf that had, much to the War Master's great sorrow, opened between the Astartes and the Remembrances. With this one grand gesture, the War Master hoped to allay any fears that such a gulf had been engineered deliberately.
He must think we are stupid, said Mercedy. Does he really think we would fall for this?
Malakhurst is a very cunning man, said Cinderman, rolling up the leaflet and placing it on the bed. You'd hardly take him for a warrior anymore. He's trying to flush the three of us out, hoping that no remembrancer could resist such an offer. If I were a less moral man, I might admire him.
All the more reason not to fall into his trap, exclaimed Mercedy.
Ah, but what if it's genuine, my dear? Asked Cinderman. Imagine what we'd see on the surface of Istvan 3.
Kirill, this is a big ship, and we can hide out for a long time. When Loken comes back, he can protect us.
Like he protected Ignace.
That's not fair, Kirill, said Mercedes. Loken can help us get off the ship once we leave the Istvan system. No, said a voice behind Mercedes, and they both turned to see Euphrates Keeler. She was awake again, and her voice was stronger than Mercedes had heard it for a long time. She looked healthier than she had been since the terror in the archive. To see her standing, walking and talking after so long was still a novelty for Mercedes, and she smiled to see her friend once again. We go, she said. Euphrates, said Mercedes. Do you really? Yes, Mercedes, she said. I mean it. And yes, I am sure. It's a trap. I don't need a vision from the Emperor to see that, laughed Euphrates, and Mercedes thought there was something a little sinister and forced to it. But they'll kill us. Euphrates smiled. Yes, they will. If we stay here, they'll hunt us down eventually. We have faithful among the crew, but we have enemies too. I will not have the Church of the Emperor die like that. This will not end in shadows and murder.
Now, Miss Keeler, said Cinderman with a forced lightness of tone, you're starting to sound like me.
Maybe they will find us eventually, Euphrates, said Mercedes. But there's no reason to make it easy for them. Why let the War Master have his way when we can live a little longer? Because you have to see, said Euphrates. You have to see it. This fate, this treachery. It's too great for any of us to understand without witnessing it. Have faith that I am right about this, my friends.
It's not a question of faith now, is it? Said Cinderman.
It is time for us to stop thinking like remembrances, said Euphrates, and Mercedes saw a light in her eyes that seemed to grow brighter with every word she spoke. The imperial truth is dying. We have watched it wither ever since 6319. You either die with it, or you follow the Emperor. This galaxy is too simple for us to hide in its complexity anymore, and the Emperor cannot work his will through those who do not know if they even believe at all.
I will follow you, said Cinderman,
and Mercedes found herself nodding in agreement.
Chapter 11. Warning. Death of a World. The Last Chthonian.
Saul Tarvitz's first sight of the Coral City was the magnificent stone orchid of the Precentor's palace. He stepped from the battered Thunderhawk onto the roof of one of the palace wings, the spectacular dome soaring above him. Smoke coiled in the air from the battles within the palace, and the terrible sound of screaming came from the square to the north, along with the powerful stench of freshly spilled blood. Tarvitz took it in at a glance, the thought hitting him hard that at any moment it would be all gone. He saw Astartes moving along the roof towards him, Emperor's children, and his heart leapt to see Nausicaa's squad, with Lucius at its head, his sword smoking from the battle. "Tarvitz!" called Lucius, and Tarvitz thought he detected even more of a swagger to the swordsman's stride. "I thought you'd never make it. Jealous of the kills?"
Lucius, what's the situation?
asked Tarvitz. "The palace is ours, and Pral is dead, killed by my own hand. No doubt you can smell the World Eaters. They're just not at home unless everything stinks of blood. The rest of the city's cut off. We can't raise anyone." Lucius indicated the city's far west, where the towering form of the Dies Irae blazed fire upon the hapless Istvanians out of sight below. "Though it looks like the Death Guard will soon run out of things to kill."
We have to contact the rest of the strike force, now, said Tarvitz. The Sons of Horus and the Death Guard. Get a squad on it. Get someone up to higher ground.
"Why?" asked Lucius. "Saul, what's happening?"
We're going to be hit. Something big. A virus strike.
"The Istvanians?"
No, said Tarvitz sadly. We are betrayed by our own...
Lucius hesitated. "The War Master? Saul, what are you..."
We've been sent down here to die, Lucius. Fulgrim chose those who were not part of their grand plan.
"Saul, that's insane. cried Lucius. "Why would our Primarch do such a thing?"
I do not know, but he would not have done this without the War Master's command,
said Tarvitz.
This is but the first stage in some larger plan. I do not know its purpose, but we have to try and stop it.
Lucius shook his head, his features twisted in petulant bitterness. "No, the Primarch wouldn't send me to die, not after all the battles I fought for him. Look at what I've become. I was one of Fulgrim's chosen. I've never faltered, never questioned. I would have followed Fulgrim into hell."
But I wouldn't, Lucius, said Tarvitz, and you are my friend. I'm sorry, but we don't have time for this. We have to get the warning out and then find shelter. I'll take word to the World Eaters. You raise the Sons of Horus and Death Guard. Don't go into the details, just tell them that there is a virus strike inbound and to find whatever shelter they can.
Tarvitz looked at the reassuring solidity of the Precentor's palace and said,
There must be catacombs or deep places beneath the palace. If we can reach them, we may survive this. This city is going to die, Lucius, but I'll be damned if I'm going to die with it.
I'll get a Vox officer up here, said Lucius, a steel anger in his voice.
Good. We don't have much time, Lucius. The bombs will be launched any moment.
This is rebellion, said Lucius.
Yes, said Tarvitz. It is.
Beneath his ritualistic scars, Lucius was still the perfect soldier he had always been, a talisman whose confidence could infect the men around him, and Tarvitz knew he could rely on him. The swordsman nodded and said, Go. Find Captain Erlen. I'll raise the other legions and get our warriors into cover. I will speak with you again.
Until then,
said Tarvitz. Lucius turned to Nassike, barked an order, and ran back towards the palace dome. Tarvitz followed, looking down on the northern plaza and glimpsing the seething battle there, hearing the screams and the sound of chain blades. He looked up at the late morning sky. Clouds were gathering. Any moment, falling virus bombs would bore through those clouds. The bombs would fall all over Isstvan III, and billions of people would die. Among the trenches and bunkers that sprawled to the west of the Coral City, men and Astartes died in storms of mud and fire. The Dies Irae shuddered with the weight of fire it laid down. Moderati Cassar felt it all, as though the immense, multi-barreled Vulcan bolter were his own hand. The Titan had suffered many wounds, its legs scarred by missile detonations, and furrows scored in its mighty torso by bunker-mounted cannons. Cassar felt them all, but a multitude of wounds could not slow down the Dies Irae or turn it from its course. Destruction was its purpose, and death was the punishment it brought down on the heads of the Emperor's enemies. Cassar's heart swelled. He had never felt so close to his Emperor, at one with the God Machine, a fragment of the Emperor's own strength, instilled in the Dies Irae.
Harukin, hold to starboard,
ordered Princeps Turnip from the command chair.
Avoid those bunkers, or they'll foul the port leg.
The Dies Irae swung to the side, its immense foot taking the roofs from a tangle of bunkers, shattering artillery emplacements as it crashed forwards. A scrum of Isstvanian soldiers scrambled from the ruins, setting up heavy weapons to pour fire into the Titan as it towered over them. The Istvanians were well drilled and well armed, and though the majority of their weapons weren't the equal of a lasgun, trenches were a great leveler, and a man with a rifle was a man with a rifle when the gunfire started. The Death Guard slaughtered thousands of them as they bludgeoned their way through the trenches. But the Istvanians were more numerous, and they hadn't run. Instead, they had fallen back trench by trench, rolling away from the relentless advance of the Death Guard. The Istvanians, with their drab green-grey helmets and mud-spattered flak suits, were hard to pick out against the mud and rubble with the naked eye. But the sensors on the Dies Irae projected a sharp-edged image onto Cassar's retina that picked them out in wondrously clear detail. Cassar fired a blast of massive caliber shells, watching as columns of mud and bodies sprayed into the air like splashes in water. The Istvanians disappeared, destroyed by the hand of the Emperor.
Enemy forces massing to the port forward quadrant, said Moderati Harukin.
To Cassar, his voice felt distant, though he was just across the command bridge of the Titan.
The Death Guard can handle them, replied Turnip. Concentrate on the artillery. That could hurt us.
Below Kassar, the gunmetal forms of the Death Guard glinted around the bunkers as 2 squads of them threw grenades through the gun ports and kicked down the doors, spraying the Istvanians who still lived inside with bolter fire or incinerating them with sheets of fire from their flamers. From the head of the Dies Irae, the Death Guard looked like a swarm of beetles, with the carapaces of their power armor scuttling through the trenches. A few Death Guard lay where they had fallen, cut down by artillery fire or the massed guns of the Istvanian troops, but there were few compared to the Istvanian corpses, strewn at every intersection of trenches. Meter by meter, the defenders were being driven towards the northernmost extent of the trenches, and when they reached the white marble of a tall basilica with a spire shaped like a trident, they would be trapped and slaughtered. Kassar shifted the weapon arm of the Dies Irae to aim at a booming artillery position some 500 meters away, as it belched tongues of flame and threw explosive shells towards the Death Guard lines. "Princeps!" called Kassar. "Enemy artillery moving up on the eastern quadrant." Turnit didn't answer him, too intent on something being said to him on his personal command channel. The Princeps nodded at whatever order he had just received and shouted,
Halt! Arukan, cease the stride pattern. Kassar, shut off the ammunition feed.
Kassar instinctively switched off the cycling of the weapon that thundered from the Titan's arm, and the shock forced his consciousness back to the command bridge. He no longer looked through the eyes of the Dies Irae, but was back with his fellow officers. "Princeps?" asked Kassar, scanning the readouts. "Is there a malfunction? If there is, I'm not seeing it. The primary systems are reading fine."
"It's not a malfunction,"
replied Turnit sharply. Kassar looked up from the information scrolling across his vision in unfocused columns.
"Moderati Kassar," barked Turnit. "How's our weapon temperature?"
"Acceptable," said Kassar. "I was going to push it on that artillery."
"Close up the coolant ducts and seal the magazine feeds as soon as possible."
"Princeps?" said Kassar in confusion. "That will leave us unarmed."
"I know that,"
replied Turnit, as though to a simpleton.
"Do it, Arukan. I need us sealed."
"Sealed, sir?" asked Arukan, sounding as confused as Kassar felt.
"Yes, sealed. We have to be airtight from top to bottom,"
said Turnit, opening a channel to the rest of the mighty war machine's crew.
"All crew, this is Princeps Turnit. Adopt emergency biohazard posts right now. The bulkheads are being sealed. Shut off the reactor vents and be prepared for power down."
"Princeps," said Arukan urgently.
"Is it a biological weapon? Atomics?" "The Istvanians have a weapon we didn't know about,"
replied Turnit, but Kassar could tell he was lying.
"They're launching it soon. We have to lock down or we'll be caught in it."
Kassar looked down at the trenches through the Titan's eyes. The Death Guard was still advancing through the trenches and bunker ruins. "But Princeps, the Astartes—"
"You have your orders, Moderati Kassar," shouted Turnit, "and you will follow them. Seal us up, every vent, every hatch, or we die."
Kassar willed the Dies Irae to shut its hatches and seal all its entranceways, his reluctance making the procedures sluggish. On the ground below, he watched the Death Guard continue to grind their way through the Choral City's defenses, apparently unconcerned that the Istvanians were about to launch throw knew what at them, or unaware. As the battle raged on, the Dies Irae fell silent. The main audience chamber of the Vengeful Spirit was a colossal, columned chamber with walls of marble and pilasters of solid gold. Its magnificence was like nothing Sindaman had ever seen, and the thousands of remembrances who filled the chamber wore the expressions of awed children who had been shown some new, unheard-of wonder. Seeing many familiar faces, Sindaman guessed that the fleet's entire complement of remembrances was present for the War Master's announcement. The War Master and Malaghurst stood on a raised podium at the far end of the hall, too far away for either of them to recognize Sindaman, Mercenary, or Euphrates. Or at least, he hoped so. Who knew how sharp a legionary's eyesight was, let alone a Primarch's? Both Astartes were wrapped in cream robes, edged in gold and silver, and a detail of warriors stood beside them. A number of large pict screens had been hung from the walls. "It looks like an iterator's rally on a compliant world," said Mercedes, echoing his own thoughts. So similar was it that he began to wonder what message was to be imparted and how it would be reinforced. He looked around for plants in the audience who would clap and cheer at precise points to direct the crowd in the desired manner. Each of the screens displayed a slice of Istvan III, set against a black backdrop, scattered with bright silver specks of the War Master's fleet. "Euphrates," said Mercedy, as they made their way through the crowds of remembrances. "Remember how I said that this was a bad idea?" "Yes," said Euphrates, her face creased in a wide, innocent smile. "Well, now I think that this was a really bad idea. I mean, look at the number of Astartes here." Sindaman followed Mercedes' gaze, already starting to sweat at the sight of so many armed warriors surrounding them. If even one of them recognized their faces, it was all over. "We have to see," said Euphrates, turning and grabbing his sleeve. "You have to see." Sindaman felt the heat of her touch and saw the fire behind her eyes, like thunder before a storm, and he realized with a start that he was a little afraid of Euphrates. The crowd milled in eager impatience, and Sindaman kept his face turned from the Astartes, staring into the middle of the audience chamber. Euphrates squeezed Mercedes' hand as the pict screens leapt to life, and a gasp went up from the assembled remembrancers as they saw the bloody streets of the choral city. Clearly shot from an aircraft, the images filled the giant pict screens, and Sindaman felt his gorge rise at the sight of so much butchery. He remembered the carnage of the Whisperheads, and reminded himself that this was what the Astartes had been created to do. But the sheer visceral nature of that reality was something he knew he would never get used to. Bodies filled the streets, and arterial gore covered almost every surface, as though the heavens had rained blood. "You remembrancers say you want to see war," said Horus, his voice easily carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "Well, this is it." Sindaman watched as the image shifted on the screen, pulling back and panning up through the sky and into the dark, star-spattered heavens above. Burning spears of light fell towards the battle below. "What are those?" asked Mercedy. "They're bombs," said Sindaman, in horrified disbelief. "The planet is being bombarded." "And so it begins," said Euphrates. The plaza was a truly horrendous sight, ankle-deep in blood and strewn with thousands upon thousands of bodies. Most were blown open by bolter rounds, but many had been hacked down with chain blades or otherwise torn limb from limb. Tarvitz hurried towards the makeshift strongpoint at its center, the battlements formed from carved-up bodies heaped between the battered forms of fallen drop pods. A world-eater with blood-soaked armor and a scarred face nodded to him as he climbed the gruesome ramp of bodies. The warrior's armor was so drenched in blood that Tarvitz wondered for a moment why he hadn't just painted himself red to begin with.
"Captain Erlen,"
said Tarvitz.
"where is he?"
The warrior wasted no breath on words and simply jerked a thumb in the direction of a warrior with dozens of fluttering oath papers hanging from his breastplate. Tarvitz nodded his thanks and set off through the strongpoint. He passed wounded Astartes who were tended by an apothecary who looked as if he had fought as hard as any of his patients. Beside him lay two fallen world-eaters, their bodies unceremoniously dumped out of the way. Erlen looked up as Tarvitz approached. The captain's face had been badly burned in some previous battle, and his axe was clotted with so much blood that it better resembled a club.
"Looks like the Emperor's children have sent us reinforcements,"
shouted Erlen, to grunts of laughter from his fellow world-eaters.
"One whole warrior. We are blessed. The enemy will run away for sure."
"Captain," said Tarvitz, joining Erlen at the barricade of Istvanian dead.
"My name is Captain Saul Tarvitz, and I'm here to warn you that you have to get your squads into cover." "Into cover? Unacceptable,"
said Erlen, nodding towards the far side of the plaza. Shapes moved in their windows and between the mansions.
"They're regrouping. If we move now, they will overwhelm us."
"The Istvanians have a bioweapon," said Tarvitz, knowing a lie was the only way to convince the world-eaters.
"They're going to fire it. It'll kill everyone and everything in the Coral City. They're going to destroy their own capital. I thought this place was some kind of church, holy to them." "They've shown how much they value their own," replied Tarvitz quickly, indicating the heaps of dead in front of them. "They'll sacrifice this city to kill us. Driving us from their planet is worth more to them than this city."
So you would have us abandon this position? Demanded Erlen, as if Tarvitz had personally insulted his honor. How do you know all this? I just got here from orbit. The weapon has already been unleashed. If you're above ground when the virus strike hits, you will die. If you believe nothing else, believe that. Then where do you suggest we move to? Just to the west of this position, Captain, said Tarvitz, stealing a glance at the sky. The edge of the trench system is thick with bunkers, blast-proof shelters. If you get your men into them, they should be safe. Should be, snapped Erlen. That's the best you can offer me. Erlen stared at Tarvitz for a moment. If you are wrong, the blood of my warriors will be on your hands, and I will kill you for their deaths. I understand that, Captain, urged Tarvitz. But we don't have much time. Very well, Captain Tarvitz, said Erlen. Sergeant Fleist, left flank. Sergeant Rond, right. World Eaters, general advance to the west. Blades out. The World Eaters drew their chain axes and swords. The blood-stained assault units hurried to the front and stepped over the makeshift barricades of corpses. Are you coming, Tarvitz? Asked Erlen. Tarvitz nodded, drawing his broadsword and following the World Eaters into the plaza. Although they were fellow Astartes, he knew he was a stranger among them, as they ran, spitting battle curses and splashing through the dead towards the potential safety of the bunkers. Tarvitz glanced up at the gathering clouds and felt his chest tighten. The first burning streaks were falling towards the city. It started, said Loken. Lacoste looked up from the field vox. Fire was streaking through the sky towards the coral city. Loken tried to judge the angle and speed of the falling darts of fire. Some of them would come down between the spires of the siren hold, just like the sons of Horus's own drop pods had done hours earlier, and they would hit in a matter of minutes. Did Lucius say anything else? No, said Lacoste. Some bioweapon, that was all. It sounded like he ran into a firefight. Tarek, shouted Loken. We need to get into cover now, beneath the siren hold. Will that be enough? If they dug their catacombs deep enough, then maybe. And if not? From what Lucius said, we'll die. Then we'd better get a move on. Loken turned to the sons of Horus advancing around him. Incoming! Get to the siren hold and head down! Now! The closest spire of the siren hold was a towering monstrosity of grotesque, writhing figures and leering gargoyle faces, a vision taken from some ancient hell of Istvan's myths. The sons of Horus broke their advance formation and ran towards it. Loken heard the distinctive boom of an airborne detonation high above the city and pushed himself harder as he entered the darkness of the tomb spire. Inside, it was dark and ugly, the floor paved with tortured half-human figures who reached up with stone hands as if through the bars of a cage. There's a way down, said Torgadon. Loken followed as Astartes ran towards the catacomb entrance, a huge, monstrous stone head with a passageway leading down its throat. As the darkness closed around him, Loken heard a familiar sound drifting from beyond the walls of the siren hold. It was screaming. It was the song of the coral city's death. The first virus bombs detonated high above the coral city, the huge explosions spreading the deadly payloads far and wide into the atmosphere. Designed to kill every living thing on the surface of a planet, the viral strains released on Istvan III were the most efficient killers in the War Master's arsenal. The bombs had a high enough yield to murder the planet 100 times over and were set to burst at numerous differing altitudes and locations across the surface of the planet. The virus leapt through forests and plains, sweeping along algal blooms and riding air currents across the globe. It crossed mountains, forded rivers, burrowed through glaciers. The Imperium's deadliest weapons, the Emperor himself had been loath to use them. The bombs fell all across Istvan III, but most of all, they fell on the coral city. The World Eaters were the furthest from cover and suffered the worst of the initial bombardment. Some had reached the safety of the bunkers, but many had not. Warriors fell to their knees as the virus penetrated their armored bodies. Deadly corrosive agents laced into the viral structure of the weapons, dissolving exposed pipes and armor joints, or finding their way inside through battle damage. Astartes screamed. The sound was all the more shocking for its very existence, rather than for the horror of its tone. The virus broke down cellular bonds at the molecular level, and its victims literally dissolved into a soup of rancid meat within minutes of exposure, leaving little but sloshing suits of rotted armor. Even many of those who reached the safety of the sealed bunkers died in agony as they shut the doors, only to find they had brought the lethal virus inside with them. The virus spread through the civilian populace of Istvan III at the speed of thought, leaping from victim to victim in the time it took to breathe in its foul contagion. People dropped where they stood, the flesh sloughing from their skeletons as their nervous systems collapsed and their bones turned to the consistency of jelly. Bright explosions fed the viral feast, perpetuating the fatal reactions of corruption. The very lethality of the virus was its own worst enemy, for without a host organism to carry it from victim to victim, the virus quickly consumed itself. However, the bombardment from orbit was unrelenting, smothering the entire planet in a precisely targeted array of overlapping fire plans that ensured that nothing would escape the virus. Entire kingdoms and vassal states across the surface were obliterated in minutes. Ancient cultures that had survived Old Night and endured the horror of invasion a dozen times over fell without even knowing why, millions dying in screaming agony as their bodies betrayed them and fell apart, reducing them to rotted, decaying matter. Cinderman watched the bloom of darkness spread across the slice of the planet visible on the giant pict screens. It spread in a wide black ring, eating its way across the surface of the planet with astonishing speed, leaving grey desolation behind it. Another wave of corruption crept in from another part of the surface, the two dark masses meeting and continuing to spread like the symptom of a horrible disease.
What is it?
Whispered Mercedy.
You have already seen it,
said Euphrates.
The Emperor showed you, through me. It is death.
Cinderman's stomach lurched as he remembered the hideous vision of decay, his flesh disintegrating before him and black corruption consuming everything around him. That was what was happening on Istvan III. This was the betrayal. Cinderman felt as though the blood had drained from him. An entire world was bathed in the immensity of death. He felt an echo of the fear it brought to the people of Istvan III, and that fear, multiplied across all those billions of people, was beyond his comprehension.
You are remembrances,
said Keeler, a quiet sadness in her voice.
Both of you. Remember this and pass it on. Someone must know.
He nodded dumbly, too numbed by what he was seeing to say anything.
Come on,
said Euphrates.
We have to go.
Go? Sobbed Mercedy, her eyes still fixed on the death of a world.
Go where?
Away, smiled Euphrates, taking their hands and leading them through the immobile, horrified throng of remembrances towards the edge of the chamber. At first, Cinderman let her lead him, his limbs unable to do more than simply place one foot in front of another, but as he saw she was taking them towards the Astartes at the edge of the chamber, he began to pull back in alarm.
Euphrates, he hissed, what are you doing? If those Astartes recognize us.
Trust me, Kirill, she said. I'm counting on that. Euphrates led them towards a hulking warrior who stood apart from the others, and Cinderman knew enough of body language to know that this man was as horrified as they were at what was happening. The Astartes turned to face them, his face craggy and ancient, worn like old leather. Euphrates stopped in front of him and said,
Yakton, I need your help.
Yakton Cruz. Cinderman had heard Loken speak of him. The half-heard. He was a warrior of the old days, whose voice carried no weight amongst the higher echelons of command. A warrior of the old days.
You need my help? Asked Cruz. Who are you?
My name is Euphrates Keeler, and this is Mercedy Ollerton, said Euphrates, as if her introductions in the midst of such carnage were the most normal thing in the world. And this is Kirill Cinderman. Cinderman could see the recognition in Cruz's face, and he closed his eyes as he awaited the inevitable shout that would see them revealed.
Loken asked me to look out for you, said Cruz. Loken? Asked Mercedy. Have you heard from him?
Cruz shook his head, but said,
He asked me to keep you safe while he was gone. I think I know what he meant now.
What do you mean? Asked Cinnamon, not liking the way Cruz kept casting wary glances at the armed warriors that lined the walls of the chamber.
Never mind,
said Cruz.
Yakton?
Commanded Euphrates, her voice laden with quiet authority.
Look at me.
The craggy-featured Astartes looked down at the slight form of Euphrates, and Cinnamon could feel the power and determination that flowed from her.
You are the half-herd no longer, said Euphrates.
Now your voice will be heard louder than any other in your legion. You cling to the old ways and wish them to return with the fond nostalgia of the venerable. Those days are dying here, Yakton, but with your help, we can bring them back again.
What are you talking about, woman?
Snarled Cruz.
I want you to remember Chthoniya,
said Euphrates, and Cinnamon recoiled as he felt an electric surge of energy spark from her, as if her very skin was charged.
What do you know of the planet of my birth?
Only what I see inside you, Yakton,
said Euphrates, a soft glow building behind her eyes and filling her words with promise and seduction.
The honor and the valor from which the lunar wolves were forged. You are the only one who remembers, Yakton. You're the only one left that still embodies what it is to be an Astartes.
You know nothing of me,
he said, though Cinnamon could see her words were reaching him, breaking down the barriers the Astartes erected between themselves and mortals.
Your brothers called you the half-herd, but you do not take them to task for it. I know this because a Chthonian warrior is honorable and cares not for petty insults. I also know that your counsel is not heard because yours is the voice of a past age, when the Great Crusade was a noble thing, done not for gain, but for the good of all humankind.
Cinnamon watched as Cruz's face spoke volumes of the conflict raging within his soul. Loyalty to his legion vied with loyalty to the ideals that had forged it. At last, he smiled ruefully and said,
Nothing too arduous, he said.
He looked over towards the War Master and Malakhurst.
Come, he said. Follow me.
Where to? Asked Cinnamon.
To safety, replied Cruz. Loken asked me to look out for you, and that's what I'm going to do. Now be silent and follow me.
Cruz turned on his heel and marched towards one of the many doors that led out of the audience chamber. Euphrates followed the warrior, and Cinnamon and Mercedy trotted along after her, unsure as to where they were going or why. Cruz reached the door, a large portal of polished bronze guarded by two warriors, moving them aside with a chopping wave of his hand.
I'm taking these ones below, he said.
Our orders are that no one is to leave, said one of the guards.
And I am issuing you new orders, said Cruz,
a steely determination that Cinnamon had not noticed earlier underpinning his words.
Move aside, or are you disobeying the order of a superior officer?
No, sir, said the warriors, bowing and hauling open the bronze door. Cruz nodded to the guards and gestured that the four of them should pass through. Cinnamon, Euphrates, and Mercedy left the audience chamber, the door slamming behind them with an awful finality. With the sounds of the dying planet and the gasps of shock suddenly cut off, the silence that enveloped them was positively unnerving.
Now what do we do?
Asked Mercedy.
I get us as far away from the vengeful spirit as possible,
answered Cruz.
Off the ship?
Asked Cinnamon.
Yes,
said Cruz.
It is not safe for your kind now. Not safe at all.
Chapter 12. Cleansing. Let the galaxy burn. God Machine. The screaming of the Coral City's death throes came in tremendous waves, battering against the Precentor's palace like a tsunami. In the streets below and throughout the palace, the people of the Coral City were decaying where they stood, bodies coming apart in torrents of disintegrating flesh. The people thronged in the streets to die, keening their hatred and fear up at the sky, imploring their gods to deliver them. Millions of people screamed at once, and the result was a terrible black-stained gale of death. A war singer soared overhead,
trying to ease the agony and terror of their deaths with her songs, but the virus found her too, and instead of singing the praises of Istvan's gods, she coughed out black plumes as the virus tore through her insides. She fell like a shot bird, twirling towards the dying below. A bulky shape appeared on the roof of the precentor's palace. Ancient Rylanor strode to the edge of the roof, overlooking the scenes of horror below, the viral carnage seething between the buildings. Rylanor's dreadnought body was sealed against the world outside, sealed far more effectively than any Astartes armor, and the deathly wind swirled harmlessly around him as he watched the city's death unfold. Rylanor looked up towards the sky, where far above, the War Master's fleet was still emptying the last of its deathly payload onto Istvan III. The ancient dreadnought stood alone, the only note of peace in the screaming horror of the choral city's death.
Good job we built these bunkers tough,
said Captain Erlen. The darkness of the sealed bunker was only compounded by the sounds of death from beyond its thick walls. Pitifully few of the World Eaters had made it into the network of bunkers that fringed the edge of the trench network and barricaded themselves inside. They waited in the dark, listening to the virus killing off the city's population more efficiently than even their chain axes could. Tarvitz waited amongst them, listening to the deaths of millions of people in mute horror. The World Eaters appeared to be unmoved, the deaths of civilians meaning nothing to them. The screaming was dying down, replaced by a dull moaning. Pain and fear mingled in a distant roar of slow death.
How much longer must we hide like rats in the dark?
Demanded Erlen.
The virus will burn itself out quickly, said Tarvitz. That's what it's designed to do. Eat away anything living and leave a battlefield for the enemy to take. How do you know? Asked Erlen.
Tarvitz looked at him. He could tell Erlen the truth, and he knew that he deserved it. But what good would it do? The World Eaters might kill him for even saying it. After all, their own Primarch was part of the War Master's conspiracy.
I have seen such weapons employed before, said Tarvitz. You had better be right, snarled Erlen,
sounding far from satisfied with Tarvitz's answer.
I won't cower here for much longer.
The World Eater looked over his warriors, their blood-stained armored bodies packed close together in the darkness of the bunker. He raised his axe and called,
Wraith, have you raised the Sons of Horus? Not yet,
replied Wraith. Tarvitz could see he was a veteran, with numerous cortical implants blistered across his scalp.
There's chatter, but nothing direct. So they're still alive? Maybe.
Erlen shook his head.
They got us. We thought we'd taken this city and they got us. None of us could have known, said Tarvitz. No, there are no excuses.
Erlen's face hardened.
The World Eaters must always go further than the enemy. When they attack, we charge right back at them. When they dig in, we dig them out. When they kill our warriors, we kill their cities. But this time, the enemy went further than we did. We attacked their city, and they destroyed it to take us with them. We were all caught out, Captain, said Tarvitz. The Emperor's children, too. No, Tarvitz. This was our fight. The Emperor's children and the Sons of Horus were to behead the beast, but we were sent to cut its heart out. This was an enemy that could not be scared away or thrown into confusion. The Istvanians had to be killed. Whether the other legions acknowledge it or not, the World Eaters were the ones who had to win this city, and we take responsibility for our failures. It's not your responsibility, said Tarvitz. A lesser soldier pretends that his failures are those of his commanders, said Erlen, and Astartes realizes they are his alone. No, Captain, said Tarvitz. You don't understand. I mean... Got something, said Wraith from the corner of the bunker. The Sons of Horus, asked Erlen.
Wraith shook his head.
Death Guard. They took cover in the bunkers further west. What did they say? That the virus is dying down. Then we could be out there again soon, said Erlen with relish. If the Istvanians come to take their city back, they'll find us waiting for them. No, said Tarvitz. There's one more stage of the viral attack still to come. What's that? Demanded Erlen. The firestorm, said Tarvitz.
You see now, said Horus to the assembled remembrancers.
This is war. This is cruelty and death. This is what we do for you, and yet you turn your face from it. Weeping men and women clung to one another in the wake of such monstrous genocide, unable to comprehend the scale of the slaughter that had just been enacted in the name of the Imperium. You have come to my ship to chronicle the Great Crusade, and there is much to be said for what you have achieved, but things change and times move on, continued Horus, as the Astartes warriors along the flank of the chamber closed the doors and stood before them with their bolters held across their chests. The Great Crusade is over, said Horus, his voice booming with power and strength. The ideals it once stood for are dead, till now. Now, I will bring the Crusade back to its rightful path and rescue the galaxy from its abandonment at the hands of the Emperor. Astonished gasps and wails spread around the chamber at Horus's words, and he relished the freedom he felt in saying them out loud. The need for secrecy and misdirection was no more. Now he could unveil the grandeur of his designs for the galaxy and cast aside his false facade to reveal his true purpose. You cry out, but mere mortals cannot hope to comprehend the scale of my plans, said Horus, savoring the looks of panic that began to spread around the audience chamber. No iterator could have ever had a crowd so completely in the palm of his hand. Unfortunately, this means that there is no place for the likes of you in this new crusade. I am to embark on the greatest war ever unleashed on the galaxy, and I cannot be swayed from my course by those who harbor disloyalty. Horus smiled, the smile of an angelic executioner. Kill them, he said. All of them. Bolter fire stabbed into the crowd at the War Master's order. Flesh burst in wet explosions, and 100 bodies fell in the first fusillade. The screaming began as the crowd surged away from the Astartes who marched into their midst. But there was no escape. Guns blazed and roaring chainswords rose and fell. The slaughter took less than a minute, and Horus turned away from the killing to watch the final death throes of Istvan III. Abaddon emerged from the shadows where he and Malaghurst had watched the slaughter of the Remembrancers.
My lord,
said Abaddon, bowing low. What is it, my son?
ship surveyors report that the virus has mostly burned out.
And the gaseous levels?
Off the scale, my lord,
smiled Abaddon.
The gunners await your orders.
Horus watched the swirling, noxious clouds enveloping the planet below. All it would take was a single spark. He imagined the planet as the frayed end of a fuse that would ignite the galaxy in a searing conflagration and would lead to an inexorable conclusion on Terra. Order the guns to fire, said Horus, his voice cold. Let the galaxy burn.
Emperor preserve us,
whispered Moderati Cassar, unable to hide his horror and not caring who heard him. The miasma of rancid, putrid gases still hung thickly around the Titan, and he could only dimly see the trenches again, along with the Death Guard emerging from the bunkers. Shortly after the order to seal the Titan had been given, the Death Guard had taken cover, clearly in receipt of the same order as the Dies Irae. The Istvanians had received no such order. The Death Guard's withdrawal had drawn the Istvanian soldiers forwards, and they had borne the full brunt of the bioweapon. Masses of mucus-like flesh choked the trenches, half-formed human corpses looming from them, faces melted, and rot-bloated bodies split open. Thousands upon thousands of Istvanians lay in rotting heaps, and thick streams of sluggish black corruption ran the length of the trenches. Beyond the battlefield, death had consumed the forests that lay just outside the Choral City's limits, now resembling endless graveyards of blackened trunks, like scorched skeletal hands. The earth beneath was saturated with biological death, and the air was thick with foul gases released by the oceans of decaying matter. "Report," said Princeps Turnit, re-entering the cockpit from the Titan's main dorsal cavity. "We're sealed," said Moderati Arukin on the other side of the bridge. "The crew's fine, and I have a 0 reading of contaminants." "The virus has burned itself out," said Turnit. "Cassar, what's out there?" Cassar took a moment to gather his thoughts,
still struggling with the hideous magnitude of death that he couldn't have ever imagined had he not seen it through the eyes of the Dies Irae. "The Istvanians are gone," he said. He peered through the swirling clouds of gas at the mass of the city to one side of the Titan. "All of them."
The Death Guard?
Kassar looked closer, seeing segments of gunmetal armor partially buried in gory choke points, marking where Astartes had fallen. "Some of them were caught out there," he said. "A lot of them are dead, but the Order must have got to most of them in time."
The Order?
"Yes, Princeps. The Order to take cover." Turnit peered through the Titan's eye on Arukan's side of the bridge, seeing Death Guard warriors through the greenish haze, securing the trenches around their bunkers and treading through the foul remains of the Istvanians.
Damn,
said Turnit. "We are blessed," said Kassar. "They could so easily have been—"
Watch your mouth, Moderati. That religious filth is a crime by the order of...
Turnit's voice cut off as movement caught his eyes. Kassar followed his gaze in time to see the clouds of gas lit up by a brilliant beam of light as a blazing lance strike slashed through the clouds of noxious, highly flammable gases. All it took was a single spark. An entire planet's worth of decaying matter wreathed the atmosphere of Istvan III in a thick shawl of combustible gases. The lance strike from the vengeful spirit burned through the upper atmosphere into the choking miasma, and its searing beam ignited the gas with a dull whoosh that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. In a second, the air itself caught light, ripping across the landscape in a howling maelstrom of fire and noise. Entire continents were laid bare, their landscapes seared to bare rock, their decayed populations vaporized in seconds as winds of fire swept across their surfaces in a deadly gale of blazing destruction. Cities exploded as gas lines went up, blazing towers of fire whipping madly in the deadly firestorm. Nothing could survive, and flesh, stone, and metal were vitrified or melted in the unimaginable temperatures. Entire sprawls of buildings collapsed, the bodies of their former occupants reduced to ashen waste on the wind. Palaces of marble and industrial heartlands destroyed in gigantic mushroom clouds as the storm of destruction swept around Istvan III with relentless, mindless destruction until it seemed as though the entire globe was ablaze. Those Astartes who had survived the viral attack found themselves consumed in flames as they desperately sought to find cover once more. But against this firestorm, there could be no cover for those who had dared to brave the elements. By the time the echoes of the recoil had faded on the War Master's flagship, billions had died on Istvan III. Moderati Kassar hung on for dear life as the tempestuous firestorm raged around the Dies Irae. The colossal titan swayed like a reed in the wind, and he just hoped that the new stabilizing gyros the Mechanicum had installed held firm in the face of the onslaught. Across from him, Arukan gripped the rails surrounding his chair with white-knuckled hands, staring in awed terror at the blazing vortices spinning beyond the command bridge. "Emperor, save us! Emperor, save us! Emperor, save us!" he whispered over and over as the flames billowed and surged for what seemed like an eternity. The heat in the command bridge was intolerable since the coolant units had been shut down when the Titan was sealed off from the outside world. Like a gigantic pressure cooker, the temperature inside the Titan climbed rapidly until Kassar felt as if he could no longer draw breath without searing the interior of his lungs. He closed his eyes and saw the ghostly green scroll of data flash through his retinas. Sweat poured from him in a torrent, and he knew that this was it. This was how he would die. Not in battle, not saying the Lectitio Divinitatis, but cooked to death inside his beloved Dies Irae. He had lost track of how long they had been bathed in fire, and the professional core of his mind saw that the temperature readings, which had been rising rapidly since the firestorm had hit, were beginning to flatten out. Kassar opened his eyes and saw the madly churning mass of flame through the viewing bays of the Titan's head, but he also saw spots of sky burned blue as the fire incinerated the last of the combustible gases released by the dead of Istvan. "Temperature dropping," he said, amazed that they were still alive. Arukan laughed as he too realized they were going to live. Princeps Turnit slid back into his command chair and began bringing the Titan systems back online.
Kassar slid back into his own chair, the leather soaking wet where his sweat had collected. He saw the readouts of the external surveyors come to life as the Princeps once again opened their systems to the outside world.
Systems check,
ordered Turnid. Arukan nodded, mopping his sweat-streaked brow with his sleeve. Weapons fine, though we'll need to watch our rate of fire, since they're already pretty hot. Confirmed, said Kassar. We won't be able to fire the plasma weapons anytime soon either. We'll probably blow our arm off if we try.
Understood, said Turnid. Initiate emergency coolant procedures. I want those guns ready to fire as soon as possible.
Kassar nodded, though he was unsure as to the cause of the Princeps' urgency. Surely there could be nothing out there that would have survived the firestorm. Certainly nothing that could threaten a Titan. Incoming, called Arukan, and Kassar looked up to see a flock of black specks descending rapidly through the crystal sky, flying low towards the blackened ruins of the burned city.
Arukan, track them,
snapped Turnid. Gunships, said Arukan. They're heading for the center of the city. What's left of the palace?
Whose are they?
Can't tell yet. Kassar sat back in the cockpit seat and let the filaments of the Titan's command systems come to the fore of his mind once again. He engaged the Titan's targeting systems, and his vision plunged into the target reticule, zooming in on the formation of gunships disappearing among the crumbling, fire-blackened ruins of the coral city. He saw bone-white colors trimmed with blue, and the symbol of fanged jaws closing over a planet. World Eaters, he said out loud. They're the World Eaters. It must be the second wave.
There is no second wave,
said Turnid, as if to himself.
Arukan, get the Vox mast up and connect me to the Vengeful Spirit.
Fleet Command? Asked Arukan.
No,
said Turnid.
The War Master.
Yacht and Cruz led them through the corridors of the Vengeful Spirit, past the training halls, past the Lupercal's court, and down through twisting passageways none of them had traversed before, even when they had been hiding from Maggard and Maloghurst. Sinderman's heart beat a rapid tattoo on his ribs, and he felt a curious mix of elation and sorrow fill him as he realized what Cruz had saved them from. There could be little doubt as to what must have happened to those remembrances in the audience chamber, and the thought of so many wonderful creative people sacrificed to serve the interests of those with no understanding of art or the creative process galled him and saddened him in equal measure. He glanced at Euphrates Keeler, who appeared to have become stronger since their escape from death. Her hair was golden and her eyes bright, and though her skin was still pallid, it only served to highlight the power within her. Mercedes Ollerton, by contrast, was visibly weakening. They will come after us soon, said Keeler. If they are not already. Can we escape? Mercedes asked, hoarsely. Cruz only shrugged.
We will, or we won't.
Then this is it? Asked Sinderman. Keeler shot him an amused glance. No, you should know better than that, Kirill. It is never it, not for a believer. There's always more, something to look forward to when it's all over. They passed a number of observation domes that looked out into the cold void of space, the sight only serving to remind Sinderman of just how tiny they were in the context of the galaxy. Even the faintest speck of light that he could see was actually a star, perhaps surrounded by its own worlds, its own people, and entire civilizations. How is it that we find ourselves at the center of such momentous events, and yet we never saw them coming? He whispered. After a while, Sinderman began to recognize his surroundings, seeing familiar signs scraped into bulkheads, and insignia he recognized, telling him that they were approaching the embarkation decks. Cruz led the way unerringly, his stride sure and confident, a far cry from the wretched sycophant he had heard described. The blast doors to the embarkation deck were closed, the tattered remnants of the votive papers and offerings made to the War Master when his sons took him to the Delphos, still fixed to the surrounding structure.
In here, said Cruz. If we're lucky, there will be a gunship we can take.
And go where? Demanded Mercedes. Where can we go that the War Master won't find us? Keeler reached out and placed her hand on Mercedes' arm. Don't worry. We have more friends than you know, Sadie. The Emperor will show me the way. The doors rumbled open, and Cruz marched confidently onto the embarkation deck. Sinderman smiled in relief when the warrior said,
There, Thunderhawk 9 Delta.
but the smile fell from his face as he saw the gold-armored form of Maggard standing before the machine. Saul Tarvitz watched the look of utter disbelief on Captain Erlin's face as he took in the scale of the destruction wrought by the firestorm. Nothing remained of the Coral City as they had known it. Every scrap of living tissue was gone, burned to atoms by the flames that roared and howled in the wake of the virus attack. Every building was black, burned, and collapsed, so that Istvan III resembled a vision of hell, its tumbled buildings still ablaze as the last combustible materials burned away. Tall plumes of fire poured skyward in defiance of gravity, fuel lines and refineries that would continue to burn until their reserves were exhausted. The stench of scorched metal and meat was pungent, and the vista before them was unrecognizable as that which they had fought across only minutes before. Why? Was all Erlin could ask. I don't know, said Tarvitz, wishing he had more to tell the world. This wasn't the Istvanians, was it? Asked Erlin. Tarvitz wanted to lie, but he knew that the World Eater would see through him instantly. No, he said. It wasn't. We are betrayed. Tarvitz nodded. Why? Repeated Erlin. I have no answers for you, brother. But if they hope to kill us all in one fell swoop, then they have failed. And the World Eaters will make them pay for that failure, swore Erlin, as a new sound rose over the crackle of burning buildings and tumbling masonry. Tarvitz heard it too, and looked up in time to see a flock of World Eaters' gunships streaking towards their position from the outskirts of the city. Gunfire came down in a burning spray, punching through the ruins around them, boring holes in the black marble of the ground. "Hold!" shouted Erlin. Heavy fire thudded down among the World Eaters as the gunships roared overhead. Tarvitz crouched at a smashed window opening beside Erlin, hearing one of the World Eaters grunt in pain as a shell found its mark. The gunships passed and soared up into the sky, looping around above the shattered palace before angling down for another run. "Heavy weapons? Get some fire up there!" yelled Erlin. Gunfire stuttered up from the gaps in partially collapsed roofs, chattering heavy bolters and the occasional ruby flare of a las cannon blast. Tarvitz ducked back from the window as return fire thundered down, stitching lines of explosions through the World Eaters. More of them fell, blown off their feet or blasted apart. One World Eater slumped down beside Tarvitz, the back of his head a pulsing red mass. The gunships banked, spraying fire down at their position. Tarvitz could see the World Eaters zeroing in on them as they flew back towards their position. Return fire lanced upwards, and one gunship fell, its engine spewing flames, to smash to pieces against a burning ruin. Tarvitz could see dozens of gunships, surely the whole of the World Eaters' arsenal.